So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about medieval mystery plays. So the tradition of medieval mystery plays was that they depicted Bible stories all the way from the creation to the Last Judgment. So the entire Bible that was being studied at the time was being depicted through these performances that were happening. And they were basically skits, for lack of a better word, of all of the different Bible stories. And this was primarily used as a way to bring the clergymen together with the peasants and have the clergymen teach peasants and the lower class citizens who maybe couldn't read or couldn't understand the church services that were happening, all of the lessons of a Bible in a more effective and relatable way. And clergymen and peasants alike performed them depending on who they were performing for. So the higher ups in the church would maybe perform for the Pope or other clergymen that perhaps weren't part of these specific productions to show them all of the different stories of the Bible in this way. It was kind of like a more entertaining, fresh take on what they had been reading, because at the time, not many people could read the Latin that the Bibles were written in. And peasants also were sometimes invited to see these, and they took what they learned and kind of formed it into their own performances that they could perform for everyone out in the public to teach people who maybe couldn't read or couldn't afford to go see these, or who maybe weren't invited because they were so low down in the social structure. It was meant to teach them the ways of the religion that was popular at the time, which was Catholicism. So originally, they were performed in religious areas like churches, and it was mostly the higher ups who would do it towards the beginning. But in 1210, when Pope Innocent III declared that these were unfit for religious life, they moved out of the church. He didn't believe that it was appropriate for this sort of theatrical take on how to teach religious life was appropriate, or what was intended when the Bible was written. So once it was outlawed by him, the peasants kind of took it on as their own thing and turned it into what we would later be able to recognize as medieval mystery plays. So what the lower class people did was they basically formed a traveling theater troupe, for lack of a better term, where they would pack everything up in a cart and move from town to town telling these Bible stories to different people and sharing the word of their God with everyone that saw the shows. And with more of the freedom, when they weren't confined by the clergymen, it became more elaborate and comical and more similar to what you would find in shows today. So the performance conventions, as I said, it was very elaborate. They brought a bunch of covered wagons, so they would have lots of props and costumes, and they had dressing rooms, much like today, to get dressed in these big costumes that would obviously over-characterize the characters that they were playing, so that the audience, even if they couldn't necessarily hear everything that was happening, they could see who these different characters were supposed to be. And through the use of color and shape, you could tell even from far away if this character was supposed to be good or was supposed to be bad. A big theme of these plays was the contrast between heaven and hell, which was supposed to be sort of an allegory for how the society was at the time, where the clergymen and Pope and all the upper class were living in this sort of heaven-like society where all of the money, all of the wealth was going to them, where the peasants were living in this terrible, terrible poverty, and their everyday lives were just mundane and terrible. And so they would split up the stage, and on one side of the stage they would have the clergymen in these big gold and red like costumes with like the rounded edges, and on the other side of the stage they would have the bad characters from the Bible stories that were supposed to represent the peasants. And when the evil characters would be on this side, they would make big gestures like this, sort of like to show that they were in charge, and they would like lift their heads up and walk in like these big strides to show that they felt that they were superior over the smaller characters, which were meant to represent the peasants, who would kind of do the complete opposite of what the people who were playing these larger than life characters would do. And so they would kind of like crouch or like hide their faces from the audience, and they would tend to be wearing like more tattered, less bright, less rounded clothing, and were meant to look just generally more unpleasant, in order to form as much of a contrast as possible between the good and the bad. And a lot of similar effects are actually used in shows today. So the impact on me is that I realized that through this, that medieval mystery plays were a huge contributor to the use of like special effects and costuming that we see today. This was sort of the beginning of these big elaborate shows that eventually turned into the big Broadway and traveling shows that we have come to know in our society. And it was also a big catalyst for theater that changes social boundaries now. It's become a bigger thing than ever in the last 50 or 60 years that plays and performances are meant to make you question what your society is like and provoke change in you. And that is what medieval mystery plays originally did. They were questioning what the church did and how they made all of the higher up classes like more important than what the peasants were. Also, a show that I was in that really I could see where medieval mystery plays had like affected it way, way down the road was Little Women, the musical, where the main character was indirectly kind of challenging societal norms, as she had more like male-like tendencies to be strong, which you can compare to the peasants having these strong personalities but having to be suppressed by the larger-than-life clergymen. And also in this show there was the use of large costumes to show which people were rich and which people were poor, and which people were kind and which people were mean. And obviously there was the larger-than-life movement in choreography, which eventually the choreography is what stemmed out of all these big movements, where the people who wanted to show their presence were doing these large movements, and everyone who didn't was doing these small things. Because before medieval mystery plays, it hadn't been heard of to use your body as a convention, but rather just your voice. So that is the impact that it has had on me, and I hope that you have learned a little bit today about medieval mystery plays.